Good afternoon to those of you who are joining us for the Opera's webinar series. I say good afternoon, but I'm sitting in Brussels. It could be that you're in the UK or elsewhere, so whatever time of day it is for you, welcome to this Opera's series on ecosystem services, our webinar series. We will be doing a series of 6 webinars over the next weeks. But we're going to start with our first one today, which is entitled How to Link Ecosystem Services, Knowledge, Tools, and Practice. We have 3 presenters today. Professor Mark Rounsfeld at the School of Geosciences at the University of Edinburgh, Dr. Genevieve Patnaud, also at the University of Edinburgh in Forest and Carbon Management, and Professor Ariana Walz, who is joining us from Germany at the University of Potsdam. She's a professor of landscape management at the Earth and Environmental Sciences Department. We will be going through the 3 presentations, and at the end of each presentation, if you have a question or would like to know something more, then please submit your question. And the way to do that is on the right-hand side of your screen. You will see a question box. And if you click on the question box and submit your question, it will go to my colleague Kathleen. And Kathleen will collect all the questions. They will be placed on Oppla, and you will receive an answer to your question. However, 3 questions, or a small number of questions, will also be taken up for immediate response in the webinar. Unfortunately, we can't take very many questions because we have to finish within 1 hour, but a small number will be sent through, and then we can have a direct interaction to the speakers. So once again, thank you for joining us. If you have a question, please just write your question into the question box, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, and it'll go through to my colleague Kathleen. It'll be put on the Oppla site, and you will receive an answer, and a small number of questions will be taken up for immediate answer in the webinar itself. That's our format for today, and it therefore gives me great pleasure to kick us off by asking Mark Rounsfeld to introduce the first of the 3 presentations and really to set the scene for today's webinar. Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martin, and good afternoon to everyone. Welcome from my point of view to this webinar series. I have the pleasure of giving you some contextual information about what this particular webinar is about, and in particular, I'm just going to very briefly introduce to you the European Commission funded project that has been funding the various activities that we're engaged in. And I'm going to talk in general terms about how to link ecosystem services, knowledge, tools, and practice. So that's what this brief introductory talk is about. So the Opera's project, the acronym stands for Operationalizing Ecosystem Research Applications, has a project which is now fairly mature. It's been running for nearly 5 years. It has 28 institutional partners and a very large contribution from the European Commission in terms of funding. The basic principle of this project is to take the originally academic concepts of ecosystem services and natural capital and try to operationalize those concepts in practice. So we're trying to move from ecosystem science towards applications in policy and in conservation management practice. A critical thing about the project in trying to achieve that is that approximately a quarter of the entire budget is given to the private sector through small and medium enterprises who are actively engaged in the research activities itself. And those organizations are part of the process of translating the science knowledge that is generated within the project into applications in practice. So how do we link ecosystem services, knowledge, tools, and practice? We have a broad framework for trying to achieve this, which is represented on these few bullet points on this slide that you'll be looking at now. First of all, we were very keen from the outset in trying to engage with a wide range of stakeholders in very many different ways in order to better understand the needs of individual users. We thought that was critical in guiding all of the activities in the project. But we've also been heavily involved in developing new tools and instruments that explore the ecosystem services and natural capital concepts. We've developed new tools, or in many cases, we've advanced and developed further existing tools. But the important point about those various methodologies is that we need to be able to test those tools in practice. So in order to do that, we've created a range of what we term exemplar case studies that are representative of specific issues or a specific context. And we've tried to use those exemplars to work both with testing the individual tools, but also engaging with various communities and stakeholder groups locally. And that was a critical part of everything we've been trying to achieve in this process, is to build communities of practice. And I'll give you some examples of one of those a little bit later on, developed within Scotland. And finally, a critical part of achieving our overall goals has been outreach and communication. And of course, you'll all be familiar with the Oppla online platform because you've signed up for this webinar through that platform. But this is an extremely important device that we feel is going to continue to live beyond the lifetime of the project itself in building collaborations between communities of science, policy and practice. And I'll say a few more words about that in a moment or two. So just to go through some of these issues, the stakeholder engagement process, as I said, was critical. That happens at many different scale levels. So we have activities that occur within individual case studies with local community groups, for example. But we also had what we termed the user board for the project, which is a way of engaging with stakeholders who have a broader perspective across the European Union. And those stakeholders have been engaging with us over a period of several years in providing critical feedback in terms of the types of activities that we've been developing. In terms of developing tools and instruments, we have a framework to achieve this, which is broadly represented in the figure on the left-hand side of this slide. So moving from data and transforming it into information, we need information tools. To move from information and using information to support decisions, we need decision support tools. And to move from decisions to implementation in practice and uptake, we need management tools or management instruments. And again, the principle of trying to achieve this is that at all stages of the tool development and testing, we've tried to understand the demand for tools and instruments that can guide which of those tools are interesting to develop further. And also we try to do that further development through the integration of science and knowledge. Rather than being a linear process, what we find is that actually the range of methods that we're employing is much more circular, as represented in this figure on the slide you're seeing at the moment, which is basically reflects the Opera's assessment cycle, how we test these various tools in practice. So you start with data and information tools such as mapping of ecosystem services and natural capital, modeling approaches, scenarios of foresight and techniques. We move through knowledge and decision support tools such as decision support tools, DSTs, Bayesian belief networks, multi-criteria decision analysis and valuation, through to policy instruments and their implementation, such as payments for ecosystem services, offsetting and green infrastructure, through to uptake and evaluation, which we've largely done through the Oppla system. And as you'll see within this figure, the policy and practice needs are firmly embedded within the center of the concept that we're trying to build together. So the exemplar case studies, as I mentioned, are an extremely important part of that process in that we have 12 case studies across Europe. Some of those are place-based, so the photo on the left is the urban-rural fringe around Dublin, but some are sectorally based, so we've also been looking at the wine sector in Europe as an exemplar. And those are basically used to test these different tools and instruments in practice. If you're interested in looking a little bit more at what we've been doing, those exemplar case studies, if you go to the Opera's website, and the link is given there, then there are a range of short videos which explain some of the work that's been going on. Developing communities of practice, incredibly important. We've developed with our various partners the Ecosystem Services Community Scotland, which is bringing together very actively groups of people engaged in both the science community but also policy and practice in a co-creation, co-development perspective. It's run a number of events now for a number of years and will continue again way beyond the lifetime of Operas. It's a really nice example of an organisation that is governed and run by people from very different backgrounds and perspectives. And finally, just the final slide from my short introductory presentation is just again to remind you about Oppla. It's about bringing together different communities of people, people who have science knowledge, people who are interested in solving problems through an online marketplace that links people with the tools and case studies and other environmental services that can be useful in operationalizing the concepts of ecosystem services and natural capital. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much, and just hand you back to Martin.
Thank you very much, Mark. Now, your presentation has sparked a number of questions, and I'll just read the first of those questions to you. And just to remind people listening, if you do want to submit a question, just go to the question box, type in your question, and then we can receive it. Go to my colleague Kathleen, and she will be handling those questions. So, Mark, one of the questions that came in is, to what extent is there a risk that too many tools are being developed without establishing winning the case for mainstreaming ecosystem services in the built environment? Has Opera's gone too far? Do we have too many tools?
Thanks, Martin. Yes, that's a really good question. There's a lot of scientific knowledge out there. There are a lot of tools and methods. I think that what one needs to do is think about this in context, in the sense that not all of the tools and methods that are available are pertinent to all given situations or contexts. So if you start looking at a given area or a given problem domain, such as I think the built environment was mentioned in the question, then there may only be a limited subset of the universe of tools that would be appropriate to address questions within that context. The other important point I think to bear in mind is this really is one of the major motivating factors for why we wanted to build the Oppla system, because the purpose of that is that users can go to the system, they can see previous case studies, of which there are very, very many examples within the Oppla system, and they can see where given tools have been useful in a given context. You can check the case study, you can see what people are saying about the tools that were useful to them, and potentially also the tools that were not interesting to them. So that provides a way of filtering, to some extent, the large number of available methods that are out there for users to use.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Well, we had another question from one of our listeners, and they write, is there not a need to communicate ecosystem services ideas in the language of the target audience to gain the necessary traction for adopting in practice? My work with planners using their frameworks and vocabularies with hooks allows me to be the translator of ecosystem services rather than the messiah.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Again, another excellent question, and I totally agree. What we've found in a lot of examples in the case studies where we're working with local communities is that some of the terminology that we might use is not necessarily appropriate to best communicate with local communities. So we might refer to other terminology. We might talk about nature, for example, or nature's benefits, rather than talking explicitly about ecosystem services. So there is a need to be able to communicate in language which is appropriate for the understanding of targeted groups. The other thing we've been trying to do, and again I would point the audience to the Opera's website, is we've been trying to build a range of educational videos that are very much introductory presentations to the concepts of ecosystem services and natural capital that try to communicate what those concepts are about. And clearly there's an important process in informing people about what those concepts mean in practice, and we've tried to use these videos as a means of doing that.
Very good, thank you. Well, we have one final question, and my apologies to all of those who have sent in questions. They will be on the Oppla website, and you will receive an answer to all of your questions. But the last one in the time that we still have is, how have you linked your work to the EKN Tools Assessor, which has sought to assess the various tools regarding their usefulness for practitioners? Maybe this links to Oppla. I don't know if you're familiar with the EKN Tools Assessor.
Could you just repeat I'm not familiar with it actually, no. The EPN? Is it
no, E for Emil, K for Kevin, and N for North Pole. And there's a
the
link.
Ecosystem Knowledge Network, I assume that's referring to?
Yeah.
Yeah. I should probably hand you over to somebody else who's engaged in that within the Opera's team, actually. John, I don't know if you want to field that question, but there is a certain amount of work going on with some of the partners in the project that links directly into the knowledge network that's referred to. Are you online, John? Do you want to respond to that question? I guess he's not online, in which case what I would suggest is we can ask John to supply a written response through the Ask Oppla system to that question a little later on.
That sounds great, and thank you very much for the question. I think that's very helpful, and if we need to link up to those platforms where they exist. Thank you very much, Mark, for giving us an introduction to linking ecosystem services, knowledge, tools, and practice. We're now going to delve in a little more deeply, and I'm going to ask Genevieve Patenot to give her presentation on the Blueprint protocol. Genevieve, we're handing over to you. I think you're going to try and put your presentation up on the screen now. There we go. Genevieve, over to you. So Genevieve, we're not getting your signal at the moment. Please make sure that the microphone is unmuted.
Okay, so thank you very much, Martin, and thank you, Mark, for the introduction to the project. So what I will be doing now is giving you an overview of the Blueprint protocol. The Blueprint protocol is basically a guide that we designed as part of the Opera project to help the exemplars design their studies, summarize their studies, but also to help us as a team to reflect on the lessons learned from a cohort of 12 plus exemplars and case studies. So the Blueprint protocol, basically, what is it? It's a modus operandi, so a sort of a mode of instruction to help the exemplars and other studies in the field of ecosystem services to report in a consistent manner, to really aid them and the teams to design their studies, to report and to synthesize their findings in a consistent way. So the idea behind this is that science should be reproducible and in a sense be able to produce results that are generalizable, so that you do not rely only on site-specific conclusions, but that you can bring those conclusions to the wider body of knowledge. There are standardized frameworks elsewhere, so they're very well known in the field of medicine, but increasingly so in the field of conservation as well. But in the field of ecosystem services, we're lagging behind a little bit. So there has been some discussion in the literature about it, and there's been some propositions made on a theoretical level, but there's been no framework in a sense that has been applied operationally. So that was our objective with this work here. So our Blueprint protocol is intended to achieve just that, and we tested the tool with those 12 exemplars that Mark introduced in the previous presentation. So what are the advantages of our protocol over others, where clearly now it's an operational protocol? So it has been utilized by an active group with real-world implications. It's also adaptive in the sense that it can be modified to suit the needs of different research group. So the protocol was designed originally at the inception of the project, but as we move throughout the years, it's been we received feedback, we adapted the protocol such that the product now is pretty robust and has been tested extensively. It's also available on demand because it's based on the cloud. It provides an easy means for data collection, so the teams can fill it up on their iPhone, on iPads, or anywhere on the road. And it also, within the Google Form facility, you have the option then to retrieve the data relatively easily, and it provides you with summaries that can be quite helpful if you want to synthesize things relatively quickly. How it works in practice, so now we're just going to quickly go onto the web and see the protocol. So this is the protocol. I assume that you can all see my screen here. So there are 8 sections. The beginning of the protocol is an introduction to the protocol. What is it for? Who are the lead authors? And how many sections there are? The protocol has 8 sections, from the summary of the study to the purpose of the study to analysis, assessment, results, and recommendation. So as the exemplar leads are asked to fill this in, they're given options to see, to read what changes have been made. But then they're then asked to fill in details of their research and throughout. So this is just giving you an overview of the protocol, how it works and how it operates. So let's go back to the presentation now. Okay. So beyond, originally the protocol is to help the teams design their studies, but beyond that, the blueprint can help synthesize a suite of complex exemplars, because we have to realize here that the studies that we have as part of Opera's are immensely diverse in their geographies, in the ecosystem service considered, in the tools used to actually provide the analysis, and the advice and recommendations given to policymakers. So our cohort of exemplars were divided in 3 thematic clusters. We have exemplars that look at regional identity, aquatic systems on the edge, and large-scale dynamics. So just those 3 thematic clusters give you an idea of the diversity of the exemplars that we have as part of the project. Now, within Oppla, you can see and visit these exemplars, and you'll find a lot more details there, but it's beyond the purpose of this presentation to go in depth into this. So this is the next part of this presentation, is giving you an idea and a sense of what kind of synthesis we can gain from that protocol. By synthesis here, we mean descriptive information about the group of exemplars, as opposed to lessons learned. That's the last part of our presentation today. So here what we see is that each exemplar investigates a multitude of ecosystem services. In total, within our 12 exemplars, about 168 ecosystem services were measured and characterized. And within those exemplars, the most studied ecosystem service at the class level is cultural, which is very interesting because that actually contrasts with the results from our meta-analysis. So we conducted a meta-analysis of the previous studies that were done on ecosystem services, and their cultural services were actually understudied. So there has been then a shift from looking at only regulating and provisioning services to much more cultural services. Trade-offs and synergies between ecosystem services are investigated in 60% of the exemplars. Again, this is important because policy decisions relating to services that are often bundled together, like food and timber, may impact other services like flood protection, tourism, nutrients like cycling, and others. So I think the idea of looking at trade-offs and synergies and the growth in that field of research is interesting in that it provides more contextual information for policy making. Here again, the use of scenario analysis are conducted in 70% of exemplars versus 31% in systematic review. This shows a shift in focus in the research and a shift of focus in linking the research to policy, because scenarios are fundamentally a policy tool to see where policy making can lead to a difference. Throughout the exemplars, there's been numerous methodologies and methods tested, but also methods were adapted and new methods and innovative methods created. So in a sense, there's novelty, but there's also solidifying the research base. In terms of stakeholders' involvement, so 38%, all exemplars integrate stakeholders' involvement compared to 38% in earlier studies investigated in the systematic review. So here again, there's a shift to really focusing on operationalization of ecosystem services. And there's a clear recognition that without engaging with stakeholders, there will not be, or very limited, operationalization. But what we find is that the techniques used to engage stakeholders have remained traditional, in a sense that the process has been much more informative rather than truly collaborative. We have found some exemplars that were really collaborative in their approach to stakeholder engagement, but traditionally the process has been much more informative. So to select stakeholders, again, exemplars use familiar techniques. Perhaps this is more within the comfort zone and also because of limited resources. Yes. So in terms of impact, here we also look throughout the blueprint, we asked the exemplars whether they felt or believed that they had an impact on either generating awareness to the concept of ecosystem services or on policy and practice. We also collected evidence to that impact. So in terms of policy, the exemplars were required to, within the protocol, to exactly specify in what way have they generated impact. But only 2 exemplars here feel that they've not created awareness, and the majority of our exemplars feel that they have impacted policy and impacted practice. Again, here are exemplars, because of their knowledge and the period of time they were engaged with the stakeholders. We felt that capturing their understanding of what creates impacts is quite important. So impact on policy and practice is believed to be mainly related to stakeholder engagement. The robustness of the evidence is a plus, but not a must. And this is quite important, again, because science has a tendency, and rightly so, to focus on robustness of evidence. And usually stakeholder engagement stays on the sideline. But what we show here from the expert opinions of our exemplar teams is that stakeholder engagement is actually perhaps more important. So what we've seen so far is that the Blueprint Protocol is a guide, provides guides for study design, provides a tool for synthesizing information, and now we're reaching the last part of my presentation, in that the Blueprint Protocol is also there to help generate lessons learned. So we decided to move beyond just looking at how the exemplar leads and the exemplar teams believe they had an impact, to looking at the evidence and looking more scientifically as to how robust evidence and stakeholders and involvement actually influence awareness, policy, and practice impact. And we do that by then assessing the quality of the evidence that was generated in each of the exemplar. And to do that, we use the analytical framework that was created by Mupepele and colleagues, also an output of the Opera project. What this diagram shows and the triangle shows is that there's different level of evidence. At the top, what we see are very strong evidence, and these generally are created through systematic review. So we think about the field of medicine, if there has been research conducted in Canada, in different populations, in Japan, in Australia, and in other parts of the world, which all, in a sense, come to the same agreement, then the reality, because this is a group of scientific evidence, this provide very strong evidence. At the lowest part of that pyramid is studies which are without underlying data, so which rely on individual expert opinion or mechanism-based reasoning. So we use that framework to score each one of the exemplar based on the evidence they produced. Likewise, we also scored the exemplars based on the quality of their stakeholder engagement. And here we use the Biodiversa Stakeholder Engagement Handbook as a basis to create that criteria matrix. So I won't go into this graphic in detail because it's quite complex and we would definitely run over time. But what this shows is basically that there are different drivers of impact. These are correlations between, at the top of the circle, we see impact awareness, impact on policy, and impact on practice. And at the bottom, we see different variables that that influence or are correlated with impact. So that graph, in a sense, is a sort of synthesis of the impact analysis that we have done. But let's look at some of the findings that we have a little bit more in detail. So the first question we have is robustness correlated with impact? What we found is that weaker level of evidence, or robustness, led on average to lower impact in all three dimensions, which is somewhat unsurprising. But perhaps more interesting is that robustness was positively related to scale. So that studies looking at larger scales had a higher level of robustness, perhaps because of the extent of data availability. And the more specific the problem, the higher the level of robustness. Again, that can be quite an interesting finding in that perhaps studies need to focus on specific problems first, rather than trying to achieve too much in a period of time. The study design, we find that more robust studies have higher impact on practice and awareness. But for impact on policy, the relationship is inverse. Less robust design have a higher impact. So we're wondering here, and we're trying to investigate whether there's a question here about resource intensity. So perhaps because of the nature of the more robust the study, the more intense perhaps the extent of resource required, and therefore there's less allocated to stakeholders engagement, which may relate more to policy impact. So stakeholder involvement here, so involvement of stakeholders at various stages and awareness has been highly correlated with impact, so that's quite important. So what this says, in a sense, is that it's important to repeat a message for learning. So the more we engage stakeholders at various stages throughout the process of a research project, the more likely we are going to have impact. The organization of stakeholders and impact on practice, what the message here, what we're seeing in terms of lessons learned is that to have an impact on practice, you have to make sure that your message is targeted for your audience. So in a sense, you have to use the appropriate language to engage with the audience that you're targeting. And then the last message here is that the diversity of stakeholders is correlated to awareness. So in a sense here, you may not know who doesn't know, so you want to be as inclusive as possible so that you can reach out and generate awareness from your project. So this is briefly a summary of what the blueprint is generating from the results of the different exemplars. And what we see is that the blueprint allows to do three things. The first thing is to synthesize and provide a guide to the exemplars to design their studies. The second one is to synthesize a suite of complex exemplars or complex studies, and then be able to generate some summaries from all of this. And ultimately, as we're in the process now of generating lessons learned, because we've just collected all the data from all the exemplars, we're able to sort of bring that together and hopefully pass on lessons learned from the various studies that we produced during the Opera project. So thank you very much.
Genevieve, thank you very much. Now, we have a couple of questions and we need to be quite quick, but before we go into those questions, from our previous discussion about the Ecosystem Knowledge Network Tool Assessor, I've just received a message that this can indeed be accessed via Oppla, so we have a formal link with that tool assessor. The tool assessor provides a consistent evaluation of a selection of tools that can be used in the UK, and the Oppla marketplace includes these tools as well as many others that are used in different parts of the world. So we do have that connection. But Genevieve, a specific question to you. From a research perspective, what types of knowledge can we produce as a science community if future studies gather data in a more coordinated way, such as using the blueprint protocol? So what are the types of knowledge that we can produce if we use the blueprint protocol?
Well, impact, one of them. So I think at the, well, if we look in the literature at the moment, there's very little that summarizes how ecosystem services, which ultimately is aiming at generating impact, does generate impact. So if we use the blueprint to actually look at how data is collected, how it is synthesized, how it is shared with stakeholders, then we can relate that to how impact is generated as a result of these studies. And I think that is a fundamental research gap, because I mean, intrinsically, the nature of the concept of ecosystem services is to generate impact, and the whole project of Opera likewise. So I think that would be, I think, perhaps, and that's why we decided to focus on impact as a result of the blueprint protocol. But there's other things that can be generated with the blueprint protocol. Trade-offs and synergies, or different tools, different tools that are used to analyze trade-offs and synergies and bundling. How successful are they to sort of generate messages that are coherent and understandable for different audiences? Yeah, I mean, ultimately, there's about 8-9 different sections in the protocol, and in each of these sections, there is a potential to sort of summarize the gathering of the data from a diverse suite of group. But I think ultimately the impact is perhaps the more salient feature.
Genevieve, thank you very much, and also thank you to those listening for your questions. Unfortunately, we can't take any more of them right now, but as said before, they are on Oppla, and you will be receiving answers to all of the questions asked. But it's now my great pleasure to move on to Ariana Walz, who will be presenting a real example of the Pentland Hills exemplar in Scotland. Ariana, over to you.
Hello, Martin, and thank you for handing over. Well, here, ladies and gentlemen, yes, I'm looking forward to introduce you today to the Pentland Hills Regional Park, where ecosystem services have been used for operational land management over the past few years. My name is Ariane Walz, but you see, I'm only one of the many people who have been involved in the ongoing activities in the Pentland Hills. The people involved include people from the regional park itself, but also policy implementation, consulting companies, and from research, of course, namely the Oppla.eu project. Well, just briefly about the Pentland Hills. The Pentland Hills are located in Scotland, right on the doorstep of Edinburgh. About half of the area of the Pentland Hills has been designated as a regional park in 1986, mainly to secure their high value for outdoor recreation for people living nearby. The park covers about 10,000 hectares and comprises many different landscape features such as farmland, pasture, moors, heather, and reservoirs. Every 10 years, a management plan is elaborated that rules out how to bridge a long-term sustainable use of the local ecosystems on the one side, with the numerous interests of park users, including visitors as well as farmers and other land users. Right from the beginning, as you'd already heard in the last two presentations, Oppla.eu's intended collaborative research setups to really make the link into practical use of the ecosystem service concept. For Scotland, therefore, a scoping meeting was organized by the University of Edinburgh, and that was in 2013. A number of environmental managers from different places in Scotland met there with researchers from the Oppla.eu project. And this is also where we got to know leaders of the Pentland Hills management team. And our collaboration started there. In the following months, we had intensive discussions with members of the Pentland Hills Consultative Forum, which includes, so that Consultative Forum includes all landowners and all organized users groups, plus the surrounding counties in the city of Edinburgh, which actually pay the bills for the park. Over the following months, we presented, discussed, and adjusted our research ideas and elaborated a questionnaire for a visitor survey in the close dialogue with some members of the Consultative Forum. Finally, Katja Schmidt from the University of Potsdam went to Scotland to conduct about 400-something on-site interviews with the help of a number of volunteers and students from Edinburgh. Quickly, I want to go quickly through the survey that we conducted. The survey included three major parts. The first part took up many questions of previous surveys which had been conducted in the Pentland Hills. This would allow then to actually make comparisons mainly of changing visitor characteristics and behavior over time. The second part addressed the social cultural value that visitors assign to ecosystem services that the regional park provides to them. Here, they had to rate a selection of ecosystem services, basically. Finally, they were asked for the preferences in future land use for the regional park. For this, we developed an interactive tool which allowed to combine different land uses in varying intensity. So you see here two images of the same tool, and the user can then sort of combine his preferences and build a complete landscape from it. Yes, but you need to know that the options to combine land uses are limited and force the user to actually make trade-offs between different land uses. For instance, intense wind farming would not allow for intense conservation measures with a large number of different birds at the same time. So you would either have intense wind farming or intense nature conservation. If you wanted to combine the two, a message would come up and would force him or her to adapt the choices. The tool is highly visual, as you can see, and very intuitive in use, I guess. I think that becomes pretty obvious from here. And it has been developed and used for on-site interviews. So this was what I just reported from, but also within an online survey for the Pentland Hills. After the Pentland Hills application, we had adopted the LandPerf tool and used it also during public events in life. So people started with 1 opinion, 2 opinions, 3 opinions, and you can see how opinions or visions actually varied and what the meaning of visions were, for instance. Last but not least, I would like to stress that the tool is now also available online through the Oppla platform and can be used for any other application once you adapt it. That means you have to adapt the visual representations and, if necessary, also the trade-off roads behind it, of course. Okay, very briefly, I would like to show you a few results. You see here, very small, but I don't want to go into detail on the results, but just to give you an idea what the results are. You see here, first the update on visitor information, and you see where people came from that have been interviewed. You can see what routes they took while they were in the park, and then you see why they came into the park. So you see whether they came for exercise, or whether they come for the view, or whether they came for the wildlife, or whatever. Then we also see here a hotspot analysis based on the places where they like best to go. Second, we see here the valuation of ecosystem services, and you see very easily that there is one ecosystem services which has been valued a lot higher than any other, and that is the physical use of the park for recreation. That means for hiking, for running, for biking, and so on. The third part of the questionnaire addressed the visions for land use, and you can easily see here that this is the median of choices, and you see that the park, people really liked the shape there. People also liked the more and more woodland restoration, and they certainly appreciate also the infrastructure that allowed them to actually go there for their recreation purposes. So while the results of the user survey were analyzed in 2015, the started progress took to some kind of, and additional actors came into play. So Scottish Natural Heritage, the Scottish government-funded nature conservation agency, started promoting pilots for the implementation of the ecosystem service approach. And our colleague, Neville Macon from SNH, who was already at a scoping workshop in 2013, remembered then our activities at the Pentland Hills and got in touch. He proposed to establish such a SNH pilot study in the Pentland Hills, which was in the end also accepted and funded by the agency. He then he contracted an environmental consulting agency, namely Collingwood Environmental Planning, to do actually the job. The heart of the project was a 6-hour workshop for the consultative forum to map ecosystem services in the park, to discuss why exactly these services were so important to them, and which ones of them were at threat and why. So that were the main points during that workshop. And the workshop in the end was held in May 2016, so just about a year ago, a bit more than a year ago. And since then, there has been a continuous dialogue with the consultative forum and all 3 other actors, SNH, the Environmental Consulting Agency, but also with the research team still. The main aim of these activities were to ultimately inform the new management plan, which will be due soon. Okay, here are some exemplary results from the workshop in 2016. First from the ecosystem service mapping, you see here that we used large printouts for the mapping exercise on the right to locate the most important areas for ecosystem service provisioning within the park with sticky dots. These maps were then digitized and further analyzed. And yes, for instance, you see here a kernel plot that indicates the hotspots of ecosystem services within the regional park. But of course, we can do several analyses with that now. Based on the very intense but less formal discussion, we could also extract the following connections between potential impacts on ecosystem services benefits and management options to steer towards a better safeguarding of these benefits. So you see on the very right the affected benefits, and you see in the darker shade of orange or brownish color, you see the top ranked ecosystem services for the park, and you see on the very left in this light green management steps that have been discussed during the workshop. So this is a bit small to read, but I will give you just one example right now. Okay, so for instance, looking to maintain and enhance recreation and use of nature, experiencing nature, and to end erosion control. It has been discussed that we need priority routes to improve, which will be improved and maintained within the park. So we need to better focus on the routes that are really important because there are limited resources, and of course we want to capture or cover at least the very important ones. Huh? And to reach this management goal, 3 management steps were identified. First, the recreational hotspot and hotspot routes, as identified in the visitor survey in the workshop, need to be approved again in the consultative forum and prioritized. Yes, so there has to be an agreement that these are really the very top ones, and we use the information that we gathered earlier to actually make sure that we take an informed decision. Then a focal management plan just for the hotspot areas should be elaborated for further to further identify measures that steer the movement of people within these areas. So even in hotspot area, you can actually steer people's movement, and you want to make sure that they stick to the paths. And finally, practical path construction and maintenance needs to be prioritized according to these agreements, of course. Okay, to conclude, in this highly collaborative setting, we were able to gain and provide information of high relevance to the park management, I guess. This includes A, the visitor survey with the user characteristic and the behavior, and the land use visions for which we used that tool. Then we did the participatory mapping of ecosystem services in the consultative forum, and we identified the threats and closely related also management requirements to meet these threats. Huh? The strong focus on the valuation of ecosystem services included both participatory and survey-based techniques. So we included both visitors as well as landowners and organized stakeholders, and that was intense and also novel for the park. Similar, the use of the interactive land pref tool nicely showed the future visions for the regional park and also partly the diversity of visions. Follow-up steps include the uptake of this process into the update of the park's management plan, and moreover, the park's management thinks about applying for external funds now to support the regional park. For that, they would build on this process and the material that had been developed over the past years. Oops. Final slide. Finally, the presented process shows how successful and meaningful the co-creation of the ecosystem service knowledge and tools turned out. The process could nicely build the bridges between a number of actors, starting from science practice collaboration. It developed step by step into a policy implementation project and included national agencies as well as environmental planning. Here we strongly profited from the parallel efforts to implement the ecosystem service approach by different organizations. A perfect timing as well as highly collaborative network of the actors led to many synergies and a strong cross-fertilization between these areas. Finally, I would like to make the point that this experience from the Pentland Hills can be also very promising for other sites. From my perspective, it is one of the certainly several very successful prototype applications where the ecosystem service concept was practically used in land management. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Of course, just write them into the little box that Martin had already announced, so we can further discuss. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ariane. Now, we don't have very much time left, so I'm only going to be able to take one question. It's an interesting one, which says, I was wondering, did you evaluate among visitors the easeability of using LandPref tool for decisions about the Pentland Hills? So did you ask them about what was their experience of using LandPref?
Okay, actually we did not ask them, but that was mainly because we used the tool with them, you know. So we had this sort of one-by-one situation, one visitor, one interview partner, so somebody who interviewed the one visitor, and so they have been guided through the tool anyway. So I guess just from what I heard, I didn't conduct interviews, but what volunteers and also Katja told me was that they usually were pretty happy to then play around and use that rather intuitive tool instead of going on with ranking and multiple choice questions, sort of.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Ariane. And also, thank you again to those who submitted questions about the Pentland Hills exemplar. Those have been put on Oppla, and you will receive answers to all of the questions, including how did visitors identify routes, which was one of the good questions that came up. I'm going to hand back to Mark Ransfeld to explain what are the next steps within Opera's. The project's about to end, but the tools, knowledge and practice will be ongoing. So handing over to you, Mark, but also with one final question that I couldn't resist. What are the big questions that the ecosystem science community still needs to answer? That was a question from earlier on. Your thoughts on that and a wrap up.
Thank you, Martin. Right, just quickly on next steps, because we've only got a couple of minutes left. This webinar is the first in a series of webinars, so I'd be delighted if those of you attending this one would be sufficiently interested to come back and participate in other webinars. We're going to be going into much more details about some of the specific aspects of the different components of the project. As Martin said, the project is finishing fairly soon. We're actually finishing after 5 years at the end of November, and we're going to go out with a bang. So we have a series of events that are planned in Brussels between the 24th and 26th of October. So please check the Opera's website and Oppla for further information about what those events will involve. There will be receptions and various presentations, for example. We will also, however, continue to make contributions to the broader policy frameworks. In particular, a number of the Oppla.eu's partners are making contributions to the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, so IPBES, and its eventual contributions to the Convention on Biological Diversity. We will be continuing with ESCOM Scotland, so that Communities of Practice will continue into the future with a number of different activities that are gradually being planned going forward. And finally, I'd like to encourage you all to engage as much as possible within Oppla. So Oppla is really the legacy of the Oppla.eu's project going forward. It will be the opportunity for the tools and the knowledge, the examples, etc., to live on way beyond the life of the project, and we hope that system to continue to evolve as a support to various communities trying to solve these different problems and issues. And the last one, Martin, is exactly 2 o'clock. Big questions still to answer. There are probably lots and lots. I'll give you one, which is the always difficult question of trying to understand truly the relationship between biodiversity, ecosystem functioning, and the provision of ecosystem services.
Mark, thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for joining this Oppla.eu's webinar, and we hope to see you at future webinars over the next few weeks. Thank you and goodbye.